February 1945. The southern coast of Crimea. The Livadia Palace, once a holiday home for Russian emperors, is now a fortress of guards, searchlights, and Secret Service men. Inside, 3 leaders sit under crystal chandeliers. But the real power in the room is not the light above them. It is the fear that, when this war ends, the next one may already be waiting. Franklin D. Roosevelt looks exhausted. Witnesses later say he seemed like a man already half in the grave, his skin pale, his shoulders slumped, his voice thin and careful. He has crossed the ocean to meet Joseph Stalin because he believes this meeting can shorten the war against Japan and save hundreds of thousands of American lives. He also knows something almost no one else in that room knows. American scientists are racing to finish a weapon capable of destroying an entire city in a single blow. Joseph Stalin sits opposite him, calm, heavy, unreadable. On paper, he is here to agree on the final push against Hitler and to discuss post-war security. In reality, his mind is already in the Far East. For years, Soviet intelligence and military planners have studied Japan, its islands, its ports, its weaknesses. Stalin has promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months after Germany's defeat. But he has no intention of doing this simply as a favor. He wants payment in land, influence, and access to the Pacific. The discussions in Yalta about Japan are not public. They take place in side rooms, in late-night sessions, in exchanges of notes and memoranda. Roosevelt's team understands that without Soviet forces attacking from the north, Japan may fight on for months, maybe longer. They present Stalin with a deal. If the Soviet Union joins the war against Japan, it will receive South Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and special rights in ports and railways in Manchuria. This much later becomes known in the official record. But there is another layer to these talks, one that will never be fully written down in the open. Behind the formal promises about islands and ports lies a deeper question. What will happen to Japan itself when the fighting stops? In Europe, the Allies have already accepted the idea of dividing Germany into occupation zones. In Korea, officials quietly discuss a temporary line of division between Soviet and American control. It is only natural that some begin to ask whether a similar arrangement might be used for Japan. In private conversations, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov pushes for more than just territory on the edges of Asia. Soviet notes and later recollections from diplomats suggest that Moscow is interested in a direct role in the occupation of Japan, not just in the surrounding areas. Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's main islands, lies close to Soviet territory and looks to Soviet planners like the logical foothold for a future Soviet zone. In Moscow, staff officers start to draw maps that do not stop at the Kuril chain, but extend south toward Japanese soil itself. On the American side, opinions are split. Some officials at the State Department and in the military believe that giving the Soviet Union a share in the occupation of Japan will keep the fragile wartime alliance intact and prevent future conflict. Others are deeply alarmed. They fear that once the Red Army steps onto Japanese territory, it will never leave. For these men, the image of Soviet troops in Hokkaido is not just a strategic problem. It is the beginning of a new political map of Asia, where the United States loses its ability to shape the Pacific on its own terms. And all the while, Roosevelt is balancing something even more dangerous than maps. In his briefings, he has been told that the secret American bomb project may deliver a usable device later that year. If the weapon works, it could end the war without the need for a Soviet invasion of Japan. If it fails, or if it is not ready in time, American forces might need every Soviet division available to break Japanese resistance. Roosevelt cannot say this openly to Stalin. He also cannot build his entire strategy on a weapon that does not yet exist. So he makes commitments in Yalta that leave room for both possibilities. To Stalin, what matters is that he leaves Yalta with a promise. The United States and Britain have recognized his right to take territory from Japan and to play a key role in Asia after the war. He returns to Moscow and immediately orders his generals to prepare. Rail lines to the Far East fill with troops and armor. Staff plans for operations in Manchuria, and beyond that, for potential landings on Japanese islands, begin to move from paper to reality. The photographs from Yalta show smiling leaders, arms linked, presenting unity to the world. They do not show the private notes in Roosevelt's folders, the guarded reports from American diplomats, or the classified outlines of Soviet invasion plans. They do not show the unspoken question hanging over the conference. Will Japan, like Germany, be carved into pieces by the victors? When Roosevelt leaves Yalta, he carries with him agreements that the public will not see in full for years. He also carries something else, though he does not live long enough to witness it: the seeds of a future confrontation. Because once he is gone, and once the bomb becomes real rather than theoretical, the understanding reached at Yalta about the Soviet role in the war against Japan will collide head-on with the new reality of American power. For now, in early 1945, the plan is still alive. The Soviet Union is preparing to strike. The United States has accepted that Moscow will be rewarded. And somewhere, between the words in those secret documents, between the promises and the fears, lies an unwritten idea that could change the map of Asia forever. A Japan not under one occupier, but under two. Summer 1944, Washington, London, Moscow. While the Red Army pushes toward Berlin and American bombers burn Japanese cities from the sky, another quieter war unfolds in cable traffic, closed embassy rooms, and handwritten notes marked "Top Secret." This war is about what will happen after the last shot is fired. It is about who will own the future of Asia. Officially, the United States and the Soviet Union are allies. Unofficially, they are already bargaining over a country that has not yet surrendered: Japan. The public hears speeches about unconditional surrender. Behind the scenes, officials trade in something far more concrete than words. They trade in ports, islands, railways, and possible occupation zones. One of the key players in this hidden drama is Averell Harriman, the American ambassador in Moscow. Harriman watches Stalin's behavior closely and sends long, nervous reports back to Washington. In his cables, he describes a Soviet leadership that has no intention of limiting itself to Europe. From Stalin down to the general staff, the message is the same. Once Germany is crushed, the Red Army will turn east, and it will expect to be rewarded. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov becomes the main voice of that expectation. In meetings with Harriman and British representatives, he is polite but cold. The Soviet Union is willing to enter the war against Japan, he repeats, but only if its legitimate interests are recognized. On paper, this means South Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and access to warm water ports in Manchuria. Between the lines, his demands are larger. Moscow wants a status in East Asia, at least equal to what it is claiming in Eastern Europe. In Washington, President Roosevelt's advisors read Harriman's dispatches and argue over what to do. The Pacific War has turned in America's favor, but every island taken from Japan costs more lives. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, looks like a nightmare. Some estimates predict hundreds of thousands of American casualties, possibly more. The idea of Soviet forces attacking Japan's empire from the north is no longer a theoretical bonus. It is a possible way to avoid an unimaginable bloodbath. This is where the bargaining begins to sharpen. American planners know that if they want Soviet troops in the Far East, they must pay with something that matters to Stalin: territory and influence. No one in the White House wants to talk openly about dividing Japan like Germany. But the logic is there, and everyone in these secret discussions feels it. If the Soviets fight and bleed against Japan, they will not be satisfied with islands on the edge of nowhere. By late 1944 and early 1945, the picture becomes more concrete. Draft memoranda circulate discussing Soviet entry into the war within a fixed time frame after Germany's defeat. In exchange, they list gains for Moscow, South Sakhalin, the Kuril chain, special rights in Port Arthur, control over parts of the Chinese Eastern Railway. On one level, it looks like a limited bargain. On another, it signals that the United States is prepared to recognize the Soviet Union as a major power in the Pacific. In London, Winston Churchill watches this with growing unease. Britain is exhausted, financially broken, and clinging to what is left of its empire in Asia. A Japan smashed by American bombs and Soviet armies could easily become a playground for two superpowers, leaving Britain a spectator in a region it once dominated. British diplomats quietly warn that bringing the Red Army into East Asia may solve one problem and create another. Once the Soviets arrive, they say, getting them to leave will be far more difficult. None of this stops the process. The momentum of the war drives the negotiations forward. Each new success in Europe pushes the question of Japan higher on the agenda. Each new intelligence report about Japanese resilience makes Soviet participation seem more valuable. By the time the leaders meet in Yalta, many of the outlines have already been sketched in these lower-level contacts. The conference will not invent the bargain. It will formalize what has been growing for months. Inside the Soviet system, the message from Stalin is simple and brutal. Prepare for the Far East. While Western newspapers still print maps of the advance on Berlin, Soviet rail networks begin to move men and equipment toward Siberia. Entire divisions are quietly reassigned eastward. Staff officers update contingency plans for operations in Manchuria and look south toward the Japanese islands. What began as theoretical studies now turns into operational planning. There is another factor tightening the clock on these talks: time. The 3-month promise agreed, in principle, means that if the Soviet Union wants a meaningful share in the final defeat of Japan, it must be ready to strike fast once Germany collapses. Every week lost after that would give the United States more time to crush Japan alone. For Stalin, this is unacceptable. He does not simply want to join the victory parade. He wants to arrive in time to claim his part of the prize. Back in Washington, the debate over how far to go with Stalin's bargain intensifies. Some officials argue that keeping the Soviet Union engaged and bound by formal agreements is the only way to prevent future conflict. If Moscow feels cheated or excluded from Asia, they warn the result could be open confrontation. Others look at the same map and see something else: a red shadow stretching from Berlin across Eastern Europe, down through Manchuria, and onto Japanese soil. They ask a question that, for now, remains only in private memos and confidential conversations. If the Soviet Union gets a foothold in Japan, will the United States ever be able to push it back? By early 1945, the outlines of the Far East Bargain are clear, even if many of the details are still fluid. The United States is prepared to accept a major Soviet role in the destruction of Japan's continental empire, and to pay for that role with territory and political influence. The Soviet Union is preparing to cash that check with armies already on the move. Neither side openly writes the words "division of Japan" on paper. They do not have to. The possibility hangs in the air, implicit in every promise, every map, every plan that assumes Soviet troops landing somewhere beyond the Asian mainland. It is in this atmosphere of urgency, fear, and calculation that the next stage of the story will unfold. The race between diplomacy, Soviet troop movements, and a weapon that, once tested, will change the value of every promise made in these secret rooms, spring 1945. In the official story of the war, it is the moment of triumph. Berlin is collapsing. Japanese garrisons across the Pacific are isolated and starving. Newspapers print headlines about victory. But inside a few locked rooms in Washington, Los Alamos, and Moscow, none of the men in charge feel victorious. They are racing against a deadline that no one has announced to the public. At the heart of this race lies a project that does not yet have a public name. In the New Mexico desert, American physicists, engineers, and military officers assemble pieces of metal and equations into something the world has never seen before: an atomic bomb. To most of the U.S. government, the project is just a line in the budget, buried under code words. To the few who are fully briefed, it is a potential solution to the nightmare of invading Japan. The problem is simple and brutal. Conventional planning says that to defeat Japan, the United States must invade the home islands in two massive operations, first in the south, then near Tokyo. The casualty estimates are not precise, but they are terrifying. Some planners talk about hundreds of thousands of American dead and wounded. Others warn that the number could reach 1 million if Japan fights, literally, to the last man. Every simulation of the invasion leads to the same conclusion. Japan can be beaten, but the price may be politically and morally unbearable. That is why, even before Franklin Roosevelt dies in April 1945, the atomic project is no longer just a scientific gamble. It is a strategic bet. If the bomb works, it might force Japan to surrender without an invasion. If it fails, the United States will have to fall back on the old plan and hope that Soviet entry into the war from the north shortens the agony. When Harry Truman becomes president after Roosevelt's sudden death, he steps into this world of half-spoken plans and terrible choices with almost no preparation. As vice president, he had been largely kept out of Roosevelt's inner circle. Now, in his first briefings, military and scientific advisors sit across from him and explain that the United States is on the verge of mastering a weapon that can release the energy of the sun in a single blast. They also tell him something equally important. The Soviet Union does not have it, and will not have it anytime soon. This changes everything. Up to this point, the logic of involving the Soviet Union in the war against Japan has been straightforward. Soviet armies in Manchuria, and possibly even on Japanese soil, would bleed Japan from the north, while American forces attacked from the south. In exchange, Moscow would receive territory and influence as already sketched in previous agreements. But add the atomic bomb to the picture, and the logic splits. On one path, if the United States needs Soviet help, the earlier bargains stand. Stalin's price in Asia must be paid, even if it means accepting a Soviet foothold dangerously close to Japan. On the other path, if the bomb can finish the war quickly and decisively, then every promise made to Stalin in the previous months becomes a problem. Why share Japan's surrender with another great power if you do not have to? Why allow Soviet troops to land anywhere near the Japanese home islands if a single weapon can win the war without them? Truman is not the only one doing this kind of cold arithmetic. In Moscow, Stalin receives intelligence reports about a mysterious American project that combines enormous funding, secret facilities, and rushed schedules. Soviet spies embedded in the West have been sending pieces of the puzzle for years. Hints of uranium, enrichment plants, and theoretical work on chain reactions. Stalin may not know the exact yield of an American bomb, but he is convinced of one thing. The United States is trying to build a weapon that will shift the balance of power once the war is over. This knowledge makes the clock tick louder in the Kremlin. If the Red Army wants to be present at Japan's defeat, it cannot wait. Stalin's generals finalize their plans to smash the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria. At the same time, more ambitious ideas are examined. Amphibious landings on Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and potentially even Hokkaido. In internal discussions, the Soviet leadership treats its future move against Japan not merely as a military operation, but as a political act designed to secure a place in the post-war order of the Pacific. By early summer 1945, preparations on both sides of this silent race reach their peak. At Los Alamos, the first full-scale test of an atomic device is scheduled for July. The scientists worry about technical issues, but the military and political leadership worry about timing. Every week counts. The sooner the bomb is tested, the sooner Truman will know whether he can rely on it as a strategic tool, not just a theoretical possibility. At the same time, Soviet troop concentrations in the Far East grow steadily. Divisions that fought in Europe are redeployed eastward, sometimes under cover of routine movements, sometimes with open urgency. Colonel-level officers brief their men about an upcoming decisive strike against Japan. Few of the soldiers have any idea that their operation is entangled with weapons they have never heard of and promises made at conferences they will never attend. Inside the U.S. government, the internal debate narrows to a razor's edge. One camp argues that the United States should follow through on all commitments made to Stalin, test the bomb, and, if it works, use it in coordination with Soviet entry into the war. That way, they say, the alliance's unity is preserved, the war ends faster, and the burden of defeating Japan is shared. Another camp looks at the same scenario and sees a strategic disaster. If the bomb works, and the Soviets join in at the same time, then Truman will have ended the war and still given Stalin a ticket into East Asia. There is also a more personal factor. Truman reads Roosevelt's files on Yalta and the Far East, and he does not like what he finds. The idea of the Soviet Union gaining bases and influence near Japan makes him deeply uneasy. He has seen what Soviet liberation looks like in Eastern Europe. Imagining something similar in northern Japan is enough to make him question whether the bargains of 1944-45 still make sense now that the United States stands on the edge of nuclear monopoly. On the Soviet side, Stalin draws almost the opposite conclusion from the same global picture. He suspects that once the United States has a working atomic bomb, it will try to limit Soviet influence wherever possible. That means his window to secure a position in Asia is short. If he waits, the Americans may finish Japan alone, occupy the islands by themselves, and present Moscow with a fait accompli. Hence the pressure on the Soviet General Staff. Be ready to strike quickly once Germany surrenders, and make sure that Soviet troops are physically present when Japan falls. The world at large is unaware of any of this. Ordinary Americans follow the news of Okinawa and the firebombing of Tokyo. Soviet citizens hear about heroic offensives and future peace. Japanese civilians endure nightly raids and tightening blockades. None of them know that, above their heads, a different kind of countdown is underway. One side rushing troops to the Far East, the other rushing to complete a single device that can destroy a city in an instant. In mid-July 1945, just as Truman travels to a new conference in Germany to meet Stalin for the first time as president, the countdown reaches its first critical moment. In the desert, the atomic device is lifted into a steel tower and connected to instruments. Military observers, scientists, and a few senior officials wait in bunkers miles away. If the explosion fails, the United States will be forced back onto the original path: invasion plus Soviet assistance, with all the political consequences that implies. If it succeeds, the United States will have, for a brief and fragile moment, the most powerful weapon on Earth, and with it, the chance to rewrite the script that had seemed inevitable only months before. The test goes ahead. The night sky over the desert turns into day. A new sun rises and then collapses into a boiling cloud. In that instant, the balance at the core of the Far East bargain breaks. What had been a partnership of necessity with the Soviet Union over Japan turns into a question with only one real answer. Now that the bomb exists and works, will the United States still allow Stalin any share in Japan's fate? August 1945. Japan is exhausted, but not yet surrendered. Cities lie in ruins, the navy is shattered, and the army has been driven from one island after another. Yet inside Tokyo's underground bunkers, senior officers still talk about one last battle on the home islands, a final suicidal defense that will force better terms from the enemy. They do not know that, in two different capitals, two different leaders are moving to end the war on their own terms, and that each believes time is on his side. In Moscow, Stalin studies maps of Manchuria, Korea, and northern Japan. For months, his generals have been preparing a massive offensive against the Japanese Kwantung Army in China. 3 fronts, a pincer from the west, north, and east, coordinated with naval landings along the coast. The goal is not simply to defeat the Japanese forces on the continent. It is to arrive at the peace table with Soviet troops physically present in territories that matter: Manchuria, Korea, the Sakhalin Coast, the Kuril Chain, and, in the most ambitious versions of the plan, the northern tip of Japan itself. The concept of a Soviet landing on Hokkaido has moved from theoretical studies to serious planning. Staff officers draw potential beachheads on the island's eastern shore. Transport capacity is calculated, combined arms groups are assembled, and timetables are drafted. The idea is simple: strike Japan's empire in Manchuria first, then, while Tokyo is still stunned and desperate, send Soviet forces onto Japanese soil and present the Allies with a fait accompli. Once the Red Army is there, it will be almost impossible to force it out without a confrontation no one wants. In Washington, the picture looks very different. By early August, the United States has successfully tested the atomic bomb and dropped one on Hiroshima. The blast has vaporized a city in seconds, killing tens of thousands of people in a single flash and leaving a growing shadow of radiation and horror. American leaders know that they have just crossed a line in human history. They also know that this new weapon gives them something they did not have at Yalta or in any earlier bargaining session with Stalin: the realistic possibility of ending the war against Japan without any Soviet help at all. For Truman, this is not just a strategic advantage. It is a way out of a deal he never liked. When he took office and read the notes from Roosevelt's meetings and agreements, he felt trapped by promises made when the atomic bomb was still unproven and the European war was at its darkest. Now, after Hiroshima, those promises feel outdated and dangerous. The United States has the power to force Japan's surrender alone. Why should it still allow the Soviet Union to claim a share of Japan's fate? On 8th of August 1945, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and launches its offensive into Manchuria. Soviet tanks and mechanized units rip through Japanese defenses that had been carefully built up for years, but left hollow by shortages, redeployments, and defeatism. In a matter of days, the once feared Kwantung Army begins to collapse. Japanese units surrender in droves or are simply bypassed. To Stalin, this is the long-awaited moment, the proof that the Soviet Union has earned its seat among the victors in the Far East, just as in Europe. Yet Stalin's timing collides with something he cannot control. Between the decision to enter the war and the full unfolding of his plans, the United States drops a second bomb, this time on Nagasaki. The psychological impact inside Japan is immense. Whatever illusions remained about fighting on to force better terms start to crack. The emperor himself begins to lean toward surrender, arguing that to continue would mean the physical destruction of the nation. This is where the unspoken plan for a divided Japan begins to unravel in real time. In Stalin's ideal scenario, Soviet entry into the war coincides with a still resisting Japan. The Red Army smashes the Kwantung Army, secures its positions in Manchuria and Korea, and then moves swiftly to land on Hokkaido. Japan, under pressure from both North and South, finally sues for peace. When the big powers sit down to arrange the occupation, the Soviet Union can argue that it has paid in blood and deserves its own zone on Japanese soil, just as in Germany. But the speed and shock of the atomic bombings create a different sequence. Instead of a long, grinding endgame, everything accelerates. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet declaration of war combine into a single wave of catastrophe from which the Japanese leadership sees no escape. The surrender decision, once unthinkable, moves forward faster than any of the great powers expected. The window during which a Soviet landing on Hokkaido could occur before surrender is formally agreed begins to close. Soviet diplomats still push. Messages go out suggesting that the Soviet Union should have a role in occupying parts of Japan, particularly in the north. Proposals are floated that imply a joint presence or at least a shared administration in key areas. The logic is the same as it had been in earlier stages. If Soviet troops are in the theater and the Soviet flag has been raised over conquered territory, then Moscow must be given its share. In Washington, however, the mood has hardened. Truman and his advisors now see a chance to keep Japan entirely under American control. The argument is blunt. The United States has borne the main burden of the Pacific War, destroyed Japan's Navy and Air Force, and delivered the decisive blows that forced surrender. The Soviet contribution, though significant on the continent, has come at the 11th hour. Japan's home islands, American officials insist, must not be carved up. There will be no second Berlin in the Pacific. Behind closed doors, the reasoning is also ideological. American leaders have already watched Eastern Europe fall under Soviet dominance behind the language of liberation and security. They have seen how quickly temporary arrangements become permanent when Soviet troops occupy territory. Allowing a Soviet zone on Hokkaido, or anywhere in Japan, could easily create a second front line of the emerging cold conflict, this time in the northwestern Pacific. For Truman, the answer is therefore not just about who gets credit for victory. It is about preventing the next geopolitical trap. As Japan moves toward surrender, the United States acts quickly to lock in its position. Occupation plans that had been drafted long before are adjusted with a new assumption. American forces will be the sole occupying power in Japan proper. The language leaves some room for Allied presence in a symbolic sense, but the structure is clear. Command authority will rest with an American Supreme Commander, and Allied participation will be under American control, not through divided zones. Stalin still hopes to salvage part of his vision. Soviet forces continue advancing in Manchuria, move into northern Korea, and seize southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Each new gain is a bargaining chip. Yet every day that passes without a Soviet landing on Japanese soil weakens Moscow's argument for a direct occupation role in Japan itself. By the time Japanese representatives begin the formal surrender process, the facts on the ground are simple. No Soviet troops stand on the home islands, and the United States has made it clear that it intends to keep it that way. What emerges from this tangle of timing, weapons, and decisions is not a signed secret treaty dividing Japan, but something more subtle and, in some ways, more dramatic. A plan that almost happened and then was overtaken by events. The idea of a Japan split into spheres of occupation, with a Soviet zone in the north and an American zone in the south, was never fully written down in the same explicit terms as in Germany. Yet it lived in memoranda, invasion plans, and the strategic imagination of both sides. It shaped how Stalin deployed his armies and how Roosevelt, and later Truman, calculated their moves. The atomic bomb did not simply end the war against Japan. It destroyed the logic that had once made a joint occupation thinkable. Once the United States could force surrender without a Soviet landing, the political cost of inviting the Red Army onto Japanese soil became unacceptable. The result was not a formal renunciation of any earlier understanding, but a quiet, decisive shift. The United States closed the door on a divided Japan before Stalin could force it open. In the end, Stalin got pieces of his Far Eastern dream, territory, prestige, a decisive role in the defeat of Japan's continental empire. But the key prize, a zone of occupation inside Japan itself, slipped away. The deal he had counted on was never openly torn up. It simply ceased to exist the moment a single bomb turned a city into ash and gave Washington the power to say no. Right after the war, the official story sounded simple. Japan had been defeated, occupied by the United States, and transformed from a militarist empire into a peaceful democracy. Schools, textbooks, and public speeches repeated the same image: a clean break with the past, a clear American-led reconstruction, and a straight line into the future. But beneath that clean narrative lay something far messier. A story of erased options, buried plans, and a victory that quietly set the stage for the next conflict. The first consequence of the undivided occupation was geographical and brutal in its clarity. There was no Japanese version of Berlin, no Hokkaido turned into a Northern People's Republic, no Soviet zone with red flags over government buildings and party committees in city halls. The map that might have shown a split Japan never came into existence. Instead, one flag flew over Tokyo Bay, and one supreme commander ruled in the emperor's shadow, backed by American troops, American ships, and American control of the air. The absence of Soviet troops on the home islands became a fact so normal that, over time, people stopped realizing how unusual it actually was. This monopoly of presence gave the United States something it did not have in Germany: the ability to shape an entire former enemy state without a rival power sitting across the negotiation table. Reforms, purges, new institutions, and later reversals of those reforms all took place within a framework that America controlled. When Washington decided to demilitarize Japan, it happened. When Washington decided to rebuild Japanese industry as a bulwark against communism, that happened too. There was no Soviet military government in Sapporo or Hakodate pushing in the opposite direction, no competing newspapers, no rival political police. Japan became a laboratory for a one-sided experiment in occupation at the dawn of the Cold War. For Moscow, the failure to secure a zone in Japan was both a strategic loss and a warning. Stalin still gained significant advantages from his late entry into the Pacific War: control over southern Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and a decisive presence in northern Korea and Manchuria. Those gains were real and would matter for decades. But they stopped at the waterline of the Japanese home islands. Every time Soviet leaders looked at a map of the region in the years that followed, they could see the edge of what might have been: a northern Japan aligned with Moscow, facing a southern Japan tied to Washington, another divided state alongside Germany and Korea. Instead, the division line that did emerge ran not through Japan, but just to its west, across the Korean peninsula. There, the logic that had almost been applied to Japan played out in full. Soviet troops in the north, American troops in the south, two governments, two ideologies, and eventually a brutal war. In a sense, Korea became the laboratory for the geopolitical arrangement that Japan narrowly avoided. The peninsula absorbed the shock of confrontation that a split Japan would likely have experienced, while Japan itself, watched from just across the sea, economically revived and militarily restrained under American protection. Inside Japan, the unseen shadow of the secret plan influenced politics even without being publicly acknowledged. The knowledge among some elites that there had once been serious discussion about a possible Soviet role in Japan reinforced the sense that the country's survival, in its existing form, had depended on timing and outside decisions. The emperor remained on the throne, the state remained territorially intact, and the occupation, though harsh and intrusive, came under a single, predictable authority. Many Japanese leaders understood that a different sequence of events, a delayed surrender, a Soviet landing in the north, could have produced a Japan permanently divided by ideology and occupation. For the United States, keeping Japan unified and within its own security sphere turned into one of the foundation stones of its Cold War strategy. American bases on Japanese territory became platforms for projecting power across East Asia, from the Korean War to the Vietnam War and beyond. Japan's economic recovery, supported and encouraged by Washington, supplied not only goods, but also political stability, on America's side of the global confrontation. The fact that there was no rival superpower entrenching itself on Japanese soil meant that every crisis in Asia, from China's revolution to regional conflicts, could be approached with the assumption that Japan's alignment was secure. And yet, there was a cost, even for Washington, in the way the deal that never was ended. The same atomic monopoly and hard rejection of joint occupation that kept the Soviets out of Japan also fed distrust in Moscow at the very beginning of the post-war order. From the Soviet point of view, the sequence of events looked like this: promises made when Soviet help was needed, a sudden new weapon, a rapid end to the war, and then a door slammed shut in their face when it came to Japan. Whether or not a formal written agreement on dividing Japan ever existed, the impression remained that American leaders had used timing and technology to sidestep an uncomfortable partnership. Over time, the memory of these near misses faded from public view. Ordinary Japanese learned about the atomic bombings, the surrender, and the occupation, but not about invasion plans that would have brought Soviet troops onto their soil. American audiences saw newsreel images of MacArthur striding through Tokyo and read about democratic reforms, not about internal debates over whether Japan might be sliced into zones like post-war Germany. Soviet citizens heard about the victory in Manchuria and the liberation of Korea, not about the ambitions for Hokkaido that had quietly dissolved in the glare of nuclear fire. Yet the shape of the post-war Pacific, the alliances, the bases, the trade routes, the fault lines of the Cold War, carries the imprint of that vanished option. A divided Japan might have produced a second Berlin crisis in the Far East, a second Korean War fought on Japanese soil, a permanent line of confrontation running through the Japanese islands themselves. Instead, a different pattern emerged: a united Japan under one occupier, facing a divided Korea and a revolutionary China across the water, while the United States and the Soviet Union glared at each other from opposite sides of the region. The question that remains is not simply whether there was a signed, secret treaty to divide Japan. The deeper question is how close the world came to treating Japan the way it treated Germany and Korea, and how much of what followed, the shape of the Cold War in Asia, the role of American power in the Pacific, the path of Japan's own recovery, was built on a decision that was never announced, never openly voted on, and never formally revoked. A plan that existed just long enough to be overtaken by a mushroom cloud, and then left behind as if it had never been real at all.